All right. So last time we spoke about, it was an introduction to the Big Y. Today I'm going to focus on the Big Y 700, which is the most advanced Big Y test you can take. So this is my agenda. We're going to talk about the Great Tree of Mankind. Then we'll talk about the Big Y 700 test. We'll jump into the Big Y block tree, which is the kind of the sandbox place to work within the Big Y 700. And then I'll talk about Bill Wood's rule of 3, which I call rule of 4, and I'll explain why, at least for my uses. All right, so if you guys recall from the last presentation, the Great Tree of Mankind, or the haplotree, is a large study of the genetic history of all human male lineages, and men inherit their Y chromosomes from their father, who inherit it from their father, and so on. And if you remember, I discussed that the tree isn't manifesting itself equally, right? It's growing at an uneven rate, with those of European descent dominating the tree. This is like Western and Eastern Europe here. So if you're of Western or Eastern European descent, that's half the entire tree. Then you have the rest of the planet represented by the rest of the haplogroups. So those of us, like I'm in Q, right? You can barely see it, or barely even noticeable. Have to work a little bit harder on getting this tree to manifest itself. All right. So unlike most other DNA that we inherit from our parents, the Y chromosome does not mix or recombine, but only accumulates a few mutations over time. So I enlisted my gummy bear friends to demonstrate autosomal DNA, like Ancestry.com or like Family Tree DNA's Family Finder. You can see that within 4 generations, the recombining of those chromosomes is getting messy. It's by that 5th, which is not even shown here, by that 5th generation, that's about as far as autosomal DNA can go. So about 5 generations or 200 years. And so Y-DNA, while Y-DNA can get to within 1 to 2 generations, it can go back, really, it's unlimited. It's literally infinite. It can just keep going all the way back to the beginning of mankind itself. All right, so this relatively slow accumulation of mutations in Y-DNA allows us to study the direct paternal lineages in great resolution. Like I said, going back thousands, tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of years. So this is my kind of the big picture, 60,000 foot view of my my branches, right? I'm QM3, which is Native American, and that branch, or this haplogroup, sits on the Q branch, and the Q branch sits on the P branch, and the P branch sits on the L branch, and the L branch sits on the K branch, and the K branch sits on the F branch, which sits on the C branch, which sits on the B branch of the A branch. So as you can see,
join the meeting.
I'm not just haplogroup Q, right? I'm a combination of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I sit on 8 different haplogroups, right? And we're all like that. So I want to do a quick, bring this over here. And I'm going to do another little share my screen. Okay, how do I do that? Oh yeah, here it is. I'm going to stop sharing. And I'm going to share a different view. Here we go. All right, so can you see the world map now? Okay, I'm actually in familytreedna.com right now, so I'm live. And so these are, so throw me out a haplogroup, any haplogroup.
R.
R? All right. So here's R. So you can see the R migration and how it went throughout the world, right? Throw another one.
Q.
All right. There's Q. Now, this is interesting. You might have people from Russia that say they're Q, and you're like, wait a minute, I thought Q was Native American. Well, QM3 is Native American, right? But Q actually, as you can see, there was a split here. How about another one?
J. E.
E? E is interesting because F here is the parent of all the other haplogroups you guys just mentioned, but E isn't. Notice E never leaves Africa. See that? So F is from F on. If I go to F, and you can see it splits out, right? So everything after F comes from F.
What about A?
See that? Okay, let's do K. Here's K.
A.
A. Oh, A. Oh, yeah. This is a good one.
A.
This is the most ancient, right, of all haplogroups.
G.
J.
J. J is a good one.
J dash M.
Let's do J. Here's J. So you can see it's around like near Israel, kind of the Middle East, right? And then
How about I?
Let's do I.
Becky, this is our Santisteban line.
See that? All right, so I'm going to go ahead and unshare, but you can see how fun that was, right? So I'm going to go back to my presentation. All right. All right. So that was fun. All right. So eventually the direct male descendants spread out all over the world and have descendants who become ancestors of large groups of men. And we refer to these anonymous men who left their genetic imprint on all present-day men by base haplogroups, letters A through T. So we just saw just a handful of base haplogroups, right? But it's really clear that, of course, what I've shown you so far, while it's interesting, it really isn't helpful for genealogy because it's too far back. And I beat that dead horse big time last time. Last time I presented. So the big Y is a high resolution next generation sequencing test, or NGS, that targets the Y chromosome to great depth and detects small mutations that differ between individuals. So this is why the big Y test is so expensive. You can get an autosomal test on sale for like $60, but the big Y test is, on sale like $480 or something like that. And it's just looking at this one chromosome at great detail. These small mutations can be used to construct a high resolution family tree of mankind, even without knowing anything about anyone's genealogy. And so I've already showed you kind of, here's the path. A, and off of A comes B, then C, then F. Remember what I said about F? F is like the parent of like almost all the other haplogroups after it. K to L to P to Q, and then Q goes to Q. QM3 is like way down here. So even after main haplogroup Q, you still have these major, really ancient, right? But then it keeps going. And so let me give you a sense of time, right? So A is like 270,000 years old. B is like 130,000 years old. QM3 is like 15,000 years old. But QFT33300 is only about 330 years old. And it's a family clade because it's within genealogical time. QFT5172 is about a little over 200 years old. And it's a family clade. And this is me. I'm QFT4174. There's only 3 people in the world with this designation. And it's not technically a haplogroup because it's not on the tree. It's what we call a private variant. And you're like, well, how in the world, Lee, do you know how do you know this, right? Well, I don't have time to go into that, but just to say that even though it's called an unnamed variant or a private variant, it is named. When you take the big Y7 test, if you have private variants, these are named and put in a database. And then when someone else comes, enough people take the test to actually name a haplogroup, it'll get placed. So if my son or my grandson were to take the big Y700 test, we'd have a new haplogroup on the tree, and that family clade would be 53 years old. So a 53-year-old family tree, family clade, 200 and some odd family clade, 300 some odd family clade, 2,000, 1,300 years old, 2,200 years old, 15,000 years old, 230,000 years old. So when we say high resolution, we can go, well, I showed you these ancient things, you can get down to people who are the fathers of haplogroups for the first time talking to you, right? That's pretty high resolution. All right. So, of course, this is all important because we're genealogists, right? So we want to be able to apply these test results to answer genealogy questions. And that was my presentation last time, where I was able to demonstrate how I could use big Y results to answer investigatory questions within genealogical time. So mutations, SNPs, singular nucleotide polymorphisms, happen on average every few generations. So on average, once every 3 or 4 generations, and can be translated into genetic progenitors who left a genetic imprint that can serve as a marker for all descendants. So remember, all those markers that I showed here, all of this information is in me. The book of mankind that's in me includes everything here, right? But my dad, my uncle, my first cousins, they don't have this entry into their book, right? Only I and my son and my grandson have this entry. And if I were to go back to my 5th great grandfather, he wouldn't have this and he wouldn't have this. He would have this and everything back forevermore. See what I'm saying? And so the tree keeps growing, the book keeps being added. And when you add a new piece to the book, you inherit everything on the book previous. All right. So discovering your family clade and its placement on the family tree of mankind is a major goal, at least for me. Being able to have haplogroups that are within genealogical time, tens of years, hundreds of years, and no older. Finding out how groups of people with the same or different surnames are related, so you can do that through Y-DNA. Pinpointing the ancestor who gave rise to a specific genetic marker, to use it to identify other descendants. And like I said, I have a mutation that represents Nicolas Espinosa, who's the progenitor of the Espinosa family in New Mexico, who is also my patrilineal ancestor. Estimate when the most recent common ancestor of your match lived. And again, for me, I have several most recent common ancestors, right? I have a one on the tree that represents this one that represents me and my first cousins and my second cousins and my third cousins. And that's our most recent common ancestors is identified by this. Then I have a third cousin, third time removed, fourth and fifth, sixth cousins that this is our most recent common ancestor. And then, of course, then I have all these 8th and 9th cousins who the mutation that represents Nicolas Espinosa is our most recent common ancestor. So we're able to get to the point where we can actually put names, right, to these haplogroups. All right, so like I mentioned last time, think of Y-DNA as an ancient book, and every man is given a copy passed down to him by all his patrilineal ancestors. And every few generations, a man is given the opportunity to write, I was here, right, in it. So unfortunately, they don't write their names or birth dates, but by comparing the books owned by different men, we can recognize common handwriting and identify their common ancestors, and we can estimate how old a man's writing is with some precision. So I'm going to stop there and open up for questions because I've kind of summarized a lot of stuff I covered last time, and then I'm about to jump into some new stuff, and we could get really lost really fast. So first of all, before I open up for questions, as I proceed, if you don't understand what I'm saying, don't worry about it. The first time it was introduced to me, I didn't understand it either, and I had to reread it and reread it and reread it for months of time before I finally started to make sense to me. And I guess I'm slow because it took me forever, but I eventually got it. So if I'm just trying to normalize this experience as we go through this, if you feel like you're getting lost, you're in good company. So, but before I go there, are there any questions about what?
Yes. Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
I'm Stella Cardoza. My husband, Bob, is QBZ4981. We did the big Y, and they said he connected to the Globus people, to that child that was buried in Montana.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
I mean, what can you tell me about this? I'm new to it, and these letters and numbers are just Greek to me.
So hang on, I'm going to come to the SNP tracker. So I'm going to unshare my screen so I can share this experience with everybody. I don't know a better way of doing this. Share screen. Yeah, here we go. All right, can everyone see SNP tracker?
Yes.
All right, so can you
Nothing
tell me
here.
that haplogroup again? It was Q what?
QBZ4981. That was through the big Y.
All right, so a warning about SNP tracker. It doesn't get the dates very accurate for Q. But so here is what it's telling me. It seems to come from Mexico. It's about, oh, this is a very young, so you have a family clade. It's only about 100, it's about 200 years old. So that tells me that you probably have more than one big Y. And you can see that it's very common to Mexico. I can't tell you I'm going to show you how it's broken here for Q. So see how it seems to go to Spain? That's wrong, right? So when you use the SNP tracker, it doesn't work for the Americas. It should see here where it's headed this direction. For some reason, it then backs up. So everything you see here is incorrect. Clearly, it didn't go. It crossed the Beringia land bridge into the Americas. So SNP tracker is great if you have a European-based background, the map part, but it's not so good for Q because it's broke. It doesn't work for us, but this piece does. So it basically tells you that that's a pretty, that you can use this with genealogy. If you can identify someone else with the same haplogroup, this family clade, then you could their genealogy would be very useful for you. But then I can also see that you sit under a large block of equivalence. You're like, I don't even know what that is. Well, guess what? We're going to go there.
Yeah.
But look how old it is, 8,800 BC. So you go from a 200-year haplogroup that sits underneath a 10,000-year-old haplogroup. And this is why I talk about the rule of 4. My recommendation is that you guys execute rule 4, the rule of 4. And again, you don't know what that is because I haven't presented it yet. So that's all I can tell you right now.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Lee, may
Yeah.
I ask a
That's
question?
it. Thank you.
Stella?
Hmm?
Stella, how many matches do you have on that big Y?
And Stella, you're on mute.
Yeah, the phone was ringing and I wanted to get it off. Pardon me, what was your question again?
How many matches do you have on the big Y?
Okay, let me look. I've got it. Oh, darn. I thought I had it. Do you have a minute? I could look.
You can
Or
tell
you want
us.
to go on and then
We'll go ahead and go on, then you can
matches?
tell us later.
Okay, I've got matches right here. Okay, I've got Ronald Meza. Let's see, genetic distance 7.
Just a number. How many do you have? Like 20?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
5.
And
Okay.
only have one with I have none with that actual haplogroup. It's QM242
And that's like a 13,000-year-old haplogroup.
and QZ780. How
So
close is that?
So right now the family clade is pretty small, right?
Right.
Yeah.
I have no one with that exact haplogroup. So, and the Rebecca, anyway, the person who administers the Q for family tree DNA, they're the ones who paid for his Y700 because they suspected he had a common ancestor with the Clovis child that they found on a ranch in Clovis, Montana, 13,000 years ago. I mean, that's what it ages.
Yeah, so that brings up very quickly. So we talked about autosomal DNA, y DNA, and mitochondrial DNA. And then there's also ancient DNA. which I was super excited about, and those of us who with native haplogroups are super excited about. Although there's also some ethical questions about that, but that's kind of the next step for those of us that if they in the future find in an ancient grave and they're able to do a DNA test, we may be able to get more. And there's actually a lot of ancestral DNA built into family tree DNA's tree. And we'll actually talk about that a little bit later. All right, can you guys see my PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay, any other questions before we proceed? All right, so when you take the big Y, FTNA does an in-house analysis of the results and presents them on the big Y block tree, which you see on the left. Or you could also see it on the haplotree, which is available to anybody, which you see on the right. So it's exactly the same. So here's my family clade QFT5172. It's right here, which is a subclade of family clade, right, which is here, and so forth. QL663 is here. These two off to the side are here. So it's a different way of reading it, but this is really kind of where when I work in Big Y, I work here in this kind of environment. We're going to talk about the Big Y block tree today. All right. So imagine that you have a book. We're going to do a magic kind of the magic experience. You wake up one morning and a miracle has happened, and there's this big book sitting by your bedstand, and you open it, and listed in it are the names of all your patrilineal ancestors in chronological order, going back, let's say, 45,000 years. Now, first of all, who wouldn't be super excited about that? That's like 15,000 names. That's of just father to father to father to father. Now, imagine, so you're super excited about that, and you call your friend over and say, come, you gotta check out this book. So they show up to your house, and you open up the book, and something has happened. Unfortunately, magic has occurred, but it's worked against you, and they've erased, some of those names have disappeared. And you can tell that, like, on average, there's only like one name per century. So it's almost like every 100 years, 2 names have been erased from your book. Now, this is still helpful because at least you have someone representing your family line every 100 years, 80 years, 100 years or so going back in time. That's still like 150 names. That's a lot. That's so great. So then, you go to have lunch with your friend, and you come back and you open up the book again, and unfortunately, it's changed again. And now the names are gone, but in its place is the YCC designation, QFT5172, QBZ1234556, going back all the way back. And you remember that there were names, and now there's not. There's a mutation number, alphanumeric code there. And you're really disappointed about that. The day goes by, you go back to bed, you wake up the next morning, you look at your book, and it's changed again. And this time, somebody has jumbled within each page, someone's jumbled the order of those SNP locations, those YCC designations, but only within the page. So page 1 has been jumbled, but they're still on page 1. They're on page 1 from the beginning. They're on page 1 when some of them were erased. They're on page 1 when they were changed to a designation. It's still on page 1, but now you've lost chronological order. So what are you left with? Well, you're left with the Big Y block tree. That's what the Big Y block tree is. It's that giant book, and each one of these mutations represents a person. This was a person's name. We already saw that, I know the name of this person. This is me. And I know this is my 3rd great grandfather, and this is my 5th great grandfather. I know those names. And this mutation here, it's not a haplogroup, but it is a mutation within the haplogroup. FT3291 represents Nicholas Espinosa. So I know the names of these people. So again, these are real people, right? What I don't know is the order. That's why I'm like, I know that this represents Nicholas, but I don't know if this is actually his. One of these mutations is his mutation that was him, but I don't know which one it is. So because this one's placed last, I'm going to say this represents him. I don't know. It could be this one, or it could be this one. All of these are phyloequivalents. We call this a block of equivalence, right? This is a block of equivalence because we don't know the order, the chronological order of these mutations. We've lost that information, at least temporarily. And so we consider them to be the same age, which can be kind of confusing because I don't know if this one's older than that one, right? So what I do in the big white block tree is I'm trying to rebuild that tree, that book, that big book I told you about, this book. I'm trying to rebuild it, re-engineer it, or backward engineer, reverse engineer this book. That's what I'm doing. And I'm going to show you how, because none of this, all this fidelity here did not exist 3 years ago. It looked a lot like this. And it looks like this because of my re-engineering work. And so this is what we do. Technically, it's possible to find out to rearrange the order and to be able to get a name for every single one of these as far back as within genealogical time. For me, genealogical time ends about right here. Before this line, there is no paper record in the Americas, right? There's no the only, I guess there are names in Stela if you're happen to descend from a king of Tikal, then I guess there's a name. But short of that, there's no paper record, right? So for me, that's as far as we go. But there's still things that we can learn going farther back, and I'm going to talk about that today. So here's an example of when I say thinking about these SNP names as people. So this SNP represents a change. For example, A to G at this specific address on the Y-DNA, right? And we named it this mutation, A to G, at this high resolution location within the Y chromosome. We've called it this SNP mutation. And this is the name of the person. It's Mayan. I decided since my ancestors were from Mexico, I would use Nahuatl, Mayan, and Tarascan names, Aztec names, to kind of make it real, right? So let's say that this is his name, and before him, his father didn't have this SNP mutation. He was born with this mutation, and all his sons and grandsons and great-grandsons for the rest of history now have this SNP mutation on their book of mankind, including me, right? But I don't know who the order of these guys. Maybe he's the father of him, or maybe he's his son. I don't know, because this is all within a block of equivalence, okay? All right, so here's kind of how breaking a block of equivalence looks like. So let's say in this hypothetical example, we have Jose, who's a descendant of Daisy. Daisy, what did Daisy mean? I had some fun here. It means adored in Mayan, right? So some Mayan guy. And so Jose is the son of Daisy, and both Jose and Daisy are descendants of this man and all of these men, right? Because they're all on a block of equivalence. This guy just happened to be QL, I'm just going to say he's QL663. So we named this whole block after this person's SNP name, QL663. So when I say, oh, I'm on haplogroup QL663, it means it really represents an individual. But technically, all of it could be that it doesn't mean QL663 is the oldest one in this block, right? So this person is just representing the block as the head, but maybe he's not. We don't know yet. So these two folks are the descendants of all of these folks. There's this block of equivalence here. Okay. And so again, we call this phyloequivalent. All right. So now suppose a new tester comes in. We don't even know who this person is, but they take the test and they end up with being a match, but they're negative for these folks in red, these three folks. These would signify that these three men were born later than the other men in this block. So a critical thing to keep in mind, and it took me a while to wrap this around my head, is that every time someone takes a test and this happens, you either descend from everyone in the block or no one. So this would not stand. It would not show up in the block tree like this. There's this, I'll take a break here and just say, when you take the big Y test, and it takes forever, it's like 3 months later, 4 months later, finally you get your results, and they're like, you get an email that says, your big Y test has been completed. Well, no. What it means is that they've gone from here to here, but your results aren't going to show on the big Y block tree yet, because this can't stand. Remember that every match tested to date either descends from everybody or none of them. And so this is this like interim position. So there's this step called manual review. So when you take the big Y and you get an email that says your test is completed, know that the analysis is not, and you still have to wait another 2 weeks. Sometimes I've waited 2 months, but most of the time it's 2 to 3 weeks for the manual review to happen, and then it will look like this. You'll never see this, right? This is this in-between state, and you notice that they've broken up the block. And so now you have these three guys in its own block subordinate to this block. We've just split the block, right? And this couldn't have happened without that tester joining the group. So remember, big Y is a team sport. And in order to re-engineer that book, I need testers. All right, so I'm going to, and this is what I'm talking about. It's a team sport. What good is having your Y chromosome sequence if you can't compare it to anybody, right? So I've shown you I have this long sequence of Y chromosomes, but it only becomes helpful if I can compare it to somebody else. So some customers take the big Y test and discover that they have many male relatives within genealogical time frame that they can use as clues to the origins of their paternal line or surname, and some don't. Remember, the tree isn't growing equally, and so, like I mentioned last presentation, your experience with the big Y test is going to depend a lot on the team. How many other people have taken the test? Do you have ancient DNA available, like that Clovis, right? Kennewick man, things like that, if you're a Native American, right? Other results are exciting in a different way. So one person's big Y result from last year came back with no matches within 45,000 years. Can you imagine that? That's, let me give you a visual of what that would look like. So this is about 2,700 years. And it's matching because this person and their son took the test. So they matched the son, but they matched nobody else other than each other. 2,700 years. There's a guy in Indonesia last year that goes back 47,000 years without a single match. Totally, it looks like this. Private variants going back 47,000 years. Now, granted, that's very rare. It's rare enough where it made big news and was actually presented at the big conference with YDNA, but it happened, right? So you never know, right? This guy is like, man, you mean I spent all this money for this test and it showed me absolutely nothing. I have no matches for 45,000 years. No one, it's just one big block that just keeps going forever.
Lee, I have a quick question. Does that mean there are no mutations for 45,000 years?
Nope. It means that his mutations are unique to him and no one else on the planet have matched any of those mutations that we've found.
Okay.
You know what I'm saying?
Okay.
Now, I think they finally found somebody because you had a corporation, FTDNA, going after that saying, we need to help this guy out. But see what I mean? It means that it just wasn't discovered yet.
Okay.
That's very rare. I mean, if you take the test and you might end up with a 13,000-year-old haplogroup, but a 45,000-year-old one with like nothing, no blocks, your chapters haven't been broken up. That's just really rare. But this guy's from Indonesia, and I think that person had migrated from Africa. It was just this very unique situation. So I want to take the time to recognize David Vance. This is his book, Genealogy's Guide to Y-DNA Testing and Genetic Genealogy. The Genealogist's Guide to Y-DNA Testing for Genetic Genealogy. This is a great book. So if you're having a hard time from my first presentation, you can read this. There's really nothing from this point on that is covered in this book, because this book doesn't get into the details I'm going on here, but it does lay a really good foundation. This picture that you see here actually comes from David Vance. So what I'm going to present today, last week, I focused on Y-DNA that was covering within genealogical time. And then I didn't have time to talk about how I'm leveraging Y-DNA to talk about lineages. So lineages are ancestry of larger distant family groups earlier than records of named ancestors. So why would you want to know that? Well, I'm going to show you. Specific lineages are mapped using Y-DNA and knowledge from later genealogies plus any applicable records. Y-DNA connections give insight into lineage origins and distributions without individual names or exact generations. So for me, I want to know, okay, I know I have a really well, I know over the last 400 years where my native line, how it migrates. But how about before then? I want to know farther back. And I was able to get a pretty good view of that by leveraging this concept. And I want to be, and my goal, and I'm hoping for, that's why I'm hoping for ancestry DNA or ancient DNA, as I was mentioned earlier, to be found, that could help me even go back farther. I want to go as far back as I can. I want to know, it's not good enough for me to know 15,000 years ago, your ancestor crossed the Beringia land bridge into North America, and then 2,000 years later, they're in the South American Southwest of Mexico. Well, how did they, that's a lot of land. How did they, what's the migration path? I want to know. All right. So my investigatory question was these are all matches to me. Was our native Mexican line indigenous to the Jalisco area, or was it imported from the South? Now, what does that mean? So I know that Nicolas de Espinosa, this represented by this mutation within this block of equivalents, I know that he was born in just north, a little, not that, maybe 100 miles northeast of Guadalajara in 1673. And so my question is, okay, is he Chichimeca? The Chichimecs were from that area, right? Or was he imported, or were his ancestors during this time frame here? So let's get some dates. So this here, whoever this person was, represented by this mutation, that's 1200 CE, right? 1200 years of the Common Era, or 1200 years AD, if you want. So if I look at this, right, somewhere between this mutation and this mutation in history, what happened? Cortez shows up. And when Cortez shows up, he completely, not personally, but that historical event reshaped the entire map of my ancestors, right? They got all mixed up. Never mind the fact that there was a huge, maybe as many as 100 million people dying, right? So you have branches just disappearing left and right. But most of the fighters were not the Spanish, right? They were the Spanish took over the Aztecs, and then guess what? Who the warriors were? The Aztecs were. If you look at the paintings, you have a Spanish officer leading the troops, and who are the troops? The Aztecs. They go take on the Tarascans, and then they fall, and then who's now the soldiers? The Tarascans, and they're moving their way north towards my ancestors' land, or is it my ancestors' land? So they're moving all of these people around. So just because Nicolas Espinosa is born north of Guadalajara doesn't mean that his ancestors lived in that area. Maybe his ancestors were soldiers that were imported from the south. Maybe they're Aztec, maybe they're Tarascan. I don't know. I want to know, and I'm going to leverage the big why to answer that question. So remember last presentation, I was answering different kinds of questions down here. All right, so let's go through that. I want to know, for example, if I were to break these haplogroups down into archaeology speak, this is the late formative in Mexico, the classic, the early post-classic, the late post-classic, the proto-historic, right? But if he's from the Southwest, maybe he came from the North. Maybe he came down through New Mexico or Arizona down into Mexico. As a matter of fact, if you look at the ancient writings of the Aztecs and the Tarascans, and you ask them, where are you from? They say the North, right? The Aztecs and the Tarascans weren't from the Valley of Mexico. They were from the North. Where was that from? Well, I don't know. Maybe it's even New Mexico. We don't know, right? So I'm matching the dates to the classifications to the haplogroups, and I know this and I know this, and I'm wanting to go farther back. I want to know where these folks are from. So again, I'm now dipping my toes here. All right. So what I do is I reach out beyond. So here is another way of looking at it. So this is me, and this is my third cousin, third time removed, and these are my 8th and 9th cousins, right? We all descend from Nicolas, and I can put on the map a pin, right? Northeast of Guadalajara. I know the name of the village. I'm going to put a pin in there, and then I'm going to go over to this guy, and he is, our most common ancestors thousands of years ago, not hundreds of years ago. And I'm going to ask Team Sanchez, hey, I want to know in your genealogy, your paternal line, where on the map is your most distant ancestor? And he says, my most distant ancestor was born in the late 1800s. His name is Victor Sanchez, and here's where he was born. And then I go farther back and say, hey, Mr. Pata, where is you're a match. You're not even a match for me. You're like, well, no, you are a match for me, but you're way out there. You're like a genetic, we match at Y111 with a genetic distance of 10. You're way out there. Where on the map is your most distant native ancestor from? And he tells me, my most distant ancestor was born in 1718. His name was Jose Mariano Pata, and here's where he was born. And I just keep going. I have this person here. Our most recent common ancestor is 10,000 years ago. I want to know, 3,000 years ago, Team Rodriguez, 10,000 years ago. I'm going way back. I'm reaching out to these guys. How do I know these guys? Or how did I even know their names? Because they're not matches to me. Well, in Family Tree DNA, if you're take the Y-DNA, you can join their projects. And so I'm in the Mexican project. I'm in the New Mexico Genealogical Society project. I'm in the New Mexico project. And so by going to these projects and talking to those project administrators, I'm able to say, hey, who is this person? Can you give me their contact information? I can tell you it's taken me years to get some of these people's email addresses. And I want to know, Team Rodriguez, that we have our most recent common ancestors 3,000 years ago. In your genealogy, where is your ancestor from? And so forth. And then I put it on a map, and this is what it looks like. I want to tell you just how, so this is me and all the descendants of Nicolas Espinosa. This is where he's from. Look, you could literally get on a horse and travel. I mean, this is tiny. What does that tell me? What do you guys think? Was my ancestor imported here? Or is he from here? Based on what I just showed you. What do you think?
From here.
Yeah, he's from here. Because these guys are, you know, thousands, 3,000, 10,000 years before you get to our most recent ancestor, and yet their descendants, even though we're separated by thousands of years, their descendants all end up living in the same area. What's the chances, right? And oh, by the way, of all of this, the youngest in genealogical time is the late 1800s. Is this guy? I bet you $100 that if I could go back farther back in time, instead of the late 1800s to like the early 1800s or the late 1700s, I'm betting that this person is from here, right? So this is where the Aztecs were, right? This is where the Tarascans were. And people don't seem to know who the Tarascans were, but the Tarascans were as advanced as the Aztecs. As a matter of fact, they were counterweights. It was like the United States and China, right? And there was this line here between the two of them that they couldn't cross because they were so equally matched. They had big temples just like the Aztecs, but for some reason we seem to know a lot more about Aztecs. And then the people here are the Chichimecs. It's a confederation of, like 8 or 9 different tribal groups that are affiliated by culture and some language. Interestingly enough, it took the Spanish no time at all to defeat the Aztecs, and it took them no time at all then. As a matter of fact, what happened is the Tarascans sent spies over here to see what was going on. The spies came back and told them what happened. So when Cortez shows up and his forces, these guys just put up their hands and say, "We give up. We saw what you did to the Aztecs. Forget it. We give in." Did you know that it took decades of time for the Spanish to defeat the Chichimecs? And you know why? These guys are semi-nomadic. How do you attack a city when they don't have a city? See what I'm saying? The Chichimecs, they followed the food. They ran. Some of those tribes didn't even wear much clothing. But boy, were they dangerous. Because how do you defeat a force like that? Because there's no force. They discovered all the silver up here, and so the Spanish here's Zacatecas, right? So the Spanish discovered silver in Zacatecas. They want to go into Zacatecas, and these Chichimecs keep attacking their caravans. They come out of nowhere, 20 to 30 at a time. I'm not talking about thousands of people like the Aztecs. 20 or 30 come out in the middle of nowhere with bows and arrows, shoots and runs and hides.
What do you know about the Tlaxcalas?
Huh?
What do you know about the Tlaxcala Indians?
Not a lot.
Okay.
But I will say that they actually never militarily defeated these groups. They actually had to finally overtook them, but they had to do it through treaty. After decades of warfare, it was just too costly. They're like, fine. So they ended up having to negotiate a treaty with these folks. And which is interesting because then just 100 years later, my ancestor ends up in the home of a high class, socially high Sephardic Jewish family. So Nicholas de Espinosa is his mother's name. His father, who I think was also adopted, he took his adopted father's last name, which was Gomes de Portugal. So for the longest time before Y-DNA, we thought, and we even had the New Mexico historians go down to Mexico to look at the records because they were doing the Sephardic studies, and they thought that Nicholas de Espinosa was a Sephardic line because his father or his grandfather was a Gomes de Portugal, which is, I know the Gomes de Portugal family. They have a book written about that family. That's J haplogroup. That's definitely a Sephardic line. So the question is, why in the world would you have a native child adopted by this upper crust, very famous, very powerful Jewish Sephardic family? Well, remember when I talked about how they defeated the Chichimecs? There was a tribe of Chichimecs that changed alliances. And remember, I mentioned there's like 7 or 8 different Chichimec. It's a confederation. Well, there was one of them that early on switched forces and joined the Spanish. My theory is that that tribe was rewarded after the treaty was done, which makes sense. They're like, hey, you join us, here's how we're going to treat you. And guess where that tribe was from? That same village. That's where that tribe that switched sides was from. So my hypothesis is that he's from that tribe. And so now I have a good sense of what tribe Nicolas de Espinosa's ancestors were from, even though I don't even have paper. And I couldn't have done any of this without Y-DNA. To this, if we didn't have Y-DNA, we'd still think he was a Sephardic Jewish line, which couldn't be farther from the truth, right? So, boy, I'm running out of time. So the rule of 4 is a modified version of the rule of 3, which was developed by Bill Wood. So I don't know if any of you are on Bill Wood's Facebook page. The haplotree has historically been built from the top down, focusing on ancient branches like QM3. And if you have, if you take a big Y test in isolation, you'll usually start with, like I said, an ancient haplogroup, right? The rule of 3, or the rule of 4, as I call it, takes a different approach. It focuses on building bottom up. So used this way, the big Y test can be used to discover previously unknown SNPs on the test search branch on the haplotree within genealogical time and break up blocks of equivalence. Remember, now that you know what a block of equivalence is. So the haplotree evolves constantly as testing reveals new data. And I gave you that example where we had the situation, this other person comes in and it breaks that block up, right? Only a test like the big Y can reveal your personal recent Y-DNA SNPs, your private variants, and your true terminal SNP. So if you take like a Y37 or a Y111, you really can't do this. You can't really get into genealogical time unless you happen to have had a close relative who did take the big Y, in which case then you can maybe piggyback on them to get some information. Because the test is expensive and multiple tests are usually required, how many? Well, the rule of 4, the rule of 3 is the number of tests. It's strategically so there's three strategically placed tests for the rule of 3, and in my case, 4 or more strategic tests. And I'll show you what I mean by strategic. So it requires a testing methodology so that you're spending as little money as possible and not wasting it. So the rule of 4 is a technique that strategically selects patrilineal relatives with the express purpose of getting all private variants named, resulting in a terminal SNP and oftentimes a family clade placed on the tree. Now I will say that David Vance isn't a fan of this process, as I can tell. He mentioned it in the book, but he's very politically savvy, and so he's not like, oh, this is a bad idea. He basically says, well, not for me. In other words, I already know everything I need to know for genealogy. I'm not going to spend money on a Y-DNA, on a big Y, for like my brother or my dad to take the test. I'm not going to do that. So that's David Vance's position, and it's a perfectly legitimate position. For me, especially because and maybe because I don't know what haplogroup he is, but I don't have the luxury. I'm from that half of the tree that's undeveloped, and I'm going to take every test I can. So I'm just speaking for myself.
Hey, Lee,
yes.
I'm sorry, but we have run out of time. So I wanted to open it up for about 10 minutes or so for questions. It's a little bit shorter than last time because some of us need to get to Dr. Salas's memorial celebration, and we still have to do our general meeting. So we can always do a third presentation.
So much
information. It's so fascinating. I love seeing the Aztec and the ancient DNA stuff about that. It's just truly fascinating. So I'm gonna have to stop you there. And
I have a question.
We'll open it up for questions in just a second. So what I wanted to explain was if you do have a question, you can certainly unmute yourself. The best way though, so we don't run over each other, is to use the tools on your Zoom to raise your hand and then let me call on you. And then we're going to do that for about 10 minutes. Okay, so I'll go ahead. The person who said you have a question, I'll go ahead and let you go. And then the rest of you, if you would please just raise your hand and I'll just go down the list of folks. And as I see hands raised, I'll let you go ahead and answer, ask your question. Okay, so
thank you. Thank you. This is Ron Maestas. Dr. Martinez, when is the best time to buy the Big Y study test?
When it goes on sale. And the next time it's going to go on sale, I think it's going to be the 27th. It's just Google National DNA Day. It's one time a year, National DNA Day, and on that day, all the tests go on sale for all the different companies. So not just FTDNA. And I think that it's April 27th, which is pretty soon.
Thank you.
If you miss that, it's always on sale the week of Father's Day, which makes sense. And then
thank you.
The tests also seem to go on sale the month of August and the month of December.
Okay, then I have Melody Montano. You have your hand raised. Go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
I do. So I have a question. You had mentioned about the EY haplogroup. You had said something like it didn't migrate out of a certain area or something like that. What does that mean?
It didn't go in from Africa. Instead of going from Africa through like the Middle East and then into Eurasia and then like that, instead it turned west into Africa and then up to Northern Europe. So it took a different way, and so it's just it's an older, more ancient haplogroup than some of us.
Okay, because that's the one I'm waiting for my big Y on. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, and I'm not seeing any more hands raised at the moment. So
I don't know how to do a hand raise. I just sent a message.
Oh. Okay. All right. Go ahead, Paula.
The message that I sent was I had my uncle, my final remaining uncle, do a Y-DNA test before he passed 2 years ago. And so would that mean would doing my male Bradley cousins be helpful, even though they're a generation further removed? And I know I only have 2 of them and a half male Bradley cousin in that generation.
Yes, just one of them though. I'm going to show you really quick what I mean by that. So you see here, I have, here's what happens. Okay, see this private variance here? This is what happens when one person takes the test. So we have these 3 guys, Cruz, Romero, and Espinosa. They're all descendants of Nicolas Espinosa, but but their haplogroup is 2,000 years old, right? Whereas my haplogroup is 100 and 200 years old. What's the difference? They've only taken 1 test. So this is what happens when you just take 1 test. Now, what happens when you take 2 tests? It names, that's the rule of 3. The rule of 1 is you take the test. The second of them, the second step is a close relative. Here's what happens when a close relative takes it. So these are father-son, Team Sanchez. See how it named all of their, so now instead of having private variants, they're all named. The rule of 3 says that now you're going to have like a 4th cousin take the test, and it's going to split this, right? This is what I did. I couldn't find a 4th cousin, so I found a 3rd cousin 3 times removed, and I split this block. That's what you do. Here's what this person did. And they did it on purpose, knowing full well that they were wasting money, but that was okay. Borsellino has 2 sons. These are his 2 sons. Borsellino had one of his sons take the test, and they named all their variants. Instead of finding a 4th cousin, he then spent $500 to have his other son take the test. Why? It doesn't get you any information. You already named all your haplogroups. So he basically threw the money away. I asked him, why did you do that? And his response was, oh, I wanted to be fair to my both 2 sons. Okay, I appreciate that you love your 2 sons so well that you want to be equal to them, but you basically, okay, I just don't understand. But had he picked a fourth cousin instead, he would have split this block, huge 1,000, 2,000-year-old block, and he would have been able to get. See what I'm saying? So yes, have one of your close relatives take the test, but only one.
Okay. Now, I'm in touch with all three, but only one of them is interested in genealogy, and that's the half cousin. So is that going to throw things off if it's him and not the other two?
If the half that's the cousin is the paternal line, it doesn't matter.
Okay.
Remember, cool. We don't worry about mixes.
Okay.
Well, I
don't know enough about this to know, but I'm working with him on genealogy, so that's person I'll go
but
to.
Technically, all things being equal, the best person is the closest related. You want the closest related. After you do that, then a fourth cousin comes next, rule of 3, and the rule of 4 is the most distant match you have. So a person, if you can find a match at Y111, that's like a genetic distance of 10. Which is what this is. See this, folks, right here. This whole branch exists because I recruited these guys. They were my most distant matches at 111, and it broke, and it sliced this branch, this block of equivalents. So all these breaks here were done on purpose by me, as I strategically selected people to start slicing away. I'm re-engineering that book. Right? I'm trying to go back and I'm re-engineering that book. And so there's a science behind it. So with relatively few tests, I've been able to do all of this, whereas you could have someone do the same number of tests and get nothing because they're just randomly having people take tests, and it's just too expensive. You need to know what you're doing if you want to save money.
Yeah. So if he tests, will those two tests, my uncle's and his test, then show more matches? Because right now we have none.
It won't show no more matches. What it will do is it will name your private variants. So it looks like this. Then, you at Y12, I would. What level test did he take?
My uncle's test I paid for after he passed was a 500.
Oh, a big Y 500?
Yeah.
Okay, so if you go into the matches list, and you can go at 111, you're saying there's no matches. You go down to Y67, maybe there's no matches. Y37, no matches. Y12. So if you go back, are you saying there's no matches even at Y12?
There's no Bradley matches.
So it doesn't matter. Surnames are irrespective. You know.
Okay.
Here's my. So this guy was Gomes de Portugal. That changed then to Espinosa, that changed to Martin, that changed to Martin Serrano, changed to Martinez, changed to Martinez. What are their surnames? And oh, by the way, before Gomes de Portugal, there were no surnames. So surnames are not important.
So the surnames that we were getting were Moore, McAllister.
Maybe you're McAllister. You don't know.
Yeah,
Maybe
that's why I've been trying to do a tree with those names, and I'm still coming up empty. So.
Yeah, so what I would do, I would go through your matches list, find the closest person you have, even if they're distant, and try to get them to take the big Y test.
Okay.
Okay, so we have actually run out of time for questions. I did post Dr. Martinez's email at the beginning of the chat, so you can always email him with your questions or save them for the next presentation, which I'm sure we'll have. So sorry about that, but it's so involved and so complicated that each question takes a lot of time.
I said it during the last presentation. I'm like, I could talk all day long on this.
Yeah.
You have to stop me because there's so much.
Right. We could probably sit here for 2 days and answer questions and do the presentation. So sorry about that. If you didn't get your question answered live, go ahead and please email Dr. Martinez, and I'm sure he'll be more than willing to do that. And so that is the end of our presentation.